Good afternoon. This is Joe Hoover. I'm the National Director for Public Sector. I'd like to, I appreciate all of you being available for joining this event. Couple of logistical items. If you have any questions during the presentation, please type those in the chat box over to the right, and we will answer those as they come up. Another thing is, if your browser locks up, please remember to click the refresh button at the top left of the browser. That might sometimes happen. You can see the presentation on the lower, perhaps the lower right part of your screen. If you double click on that, it will enlarge it for you as we go through the presentation. With that, I'd like to introduce our two presenters. Lima Giuliani, who is our Senior Director of Product Management for Public Sector, Commercial, and Healthcare, and Brenda Gill, who is our RPI Project Manager. And Brenda had the recent pleasure of taking a city client live with Global Ledger and Fund Accounting back, Brenda, about 30 days ago. Huh?
That's right.
So with that, I will present, or I will pass it off to Lima.
Thank you. We'll do some more just quick introductions. Joe mentioned that I am the Senior Director of Product Management with Infor. I did want to let you all know that I do have a background in public sector. I spent many years implementing public sector, but also a handful of years in our solution consulting department of Infor, focused on public sector. So that's why I'm involved today in today's discussion. And then Brenda, do you want to take a moment and introduce yourself?
Sure. My name is Brenda Gill, and I am a Senior Project Manager with RPI. I have been working in the public sector for many years, and also with the Infor products for close to 30 years. So I've got a lot of experience with both of them. And as Joe said earlier, we just recently went live with the city, and they chose to be an early adopter with the fund accounting. And so today we're going to talk a little bit about how they were able to use that.
Great.
Thanks, Lima.
Thank you, Brenda. So today's session is going to cover a little bit of the following topics. We'll talk a little bit about the Global Ledger, what you gain and what differences you might see between what you've had in prior versions, but additionally what you'll see in CloudSuite Financials. Additionally, we'll talk a little bit about Encumbrance Accounting. You have it today, but some of the enhancements that you'll see as well in CSF. We'll talk about the new and great and fun functionality of fund accounting. We've automated a lot of fund accounting requirements. So we'll talk in depth about that and some design considerations that go along with it if you are considering the upgrade to CloudSuite Financials. This is important information to have in your back pocket. And then we'll do a little bit of roadmap discussion as well. So since we are going to talk a little bit about the roadmap, I just do want to put in a disclaimer that, I'll talk about potential timelines and some of our bigger initiatives, but obviously, if things come up, priorities might change, timelines might change, so just keep that in mind. Okay. Let's start with the general ledger, and we're going to do a little bit of a compare and contrast. In Infor Lawson, or version prior to version 10, and including version 10, you had an accounting string. You had the accounting entity or company, an accounting unit, and an account in the general ledger. But then additionally, you also had the project ledger, which was the project and the account category. Now, you did have a strategic ledger as well. We're not going to talk about that. But between the general ledger and the project ledger, there were a number of limitations, and I know we have a lot of customers who made do with what they had, and definitely got the solution to work for them in a positive way, but there were limitations, and the levels, the 5 levels underneath the accounting unit, the 5 levels underneath project, where you were only limited to those, that was a limitation. The fact that you had to use account category if you're using project. Another limitation, we have a lot of customers who would mimic or copy their chart of accounts and put it into the account category. It was just duplicate work. There are other customers who use the account category dimension the way it was originally designed to be used, but not having that flexibility to choose was did hinder some of our customers. Because these were 2 separate ledgers, that meant that there was separate budget considerations for each. There was separate reporting for each of those, and it wasn't really comprehensive or conducive to what we know public sector needs and requirements are. But with the global ledger, what you get is dimensionality, and we're going to talk a lot about dimensionality and what I mean by it. But what I also want to point out before we get into too much dimensionality discussion is that in CloudSuite Financial, the global ledger sits on a data warehouse, and that means that with the flexibility and dimensionality that you're going to get, you're also going to have this platform where you'll be able to slice and dice all of the information that's inside the solution or in the application any way you really need to. And just think about it as a cube-based data warehouse, and the fact that each data type or data set is going to be an individual cube that you can then link or report on accordingly. Additionally, and I don't know how much detail we're really going to get into this, but keep in mind that that within CloudSuite Financials and the Global Ledger, you're going to have not just the new dimensions and dimensionality, but limitless number of adjustment ledgers that you need, a limitless number of reporting structures and levels, hierarchies, calendars that you were limited to in the past. You have the ability now to create as many calendars as you need to accommodate your different types of reporting. When we go a little further into the session, I'll give you some examples of what these might be. If we think a little bit about dimensionality, what I want to show you is a couple of different types of dimensions that you'll have or that you'll gain with CloudSuite Financials. This top row are standard dimensions. Standard dimensions just means that really every single customer who implements or upgrades to CloudSuite Financials, when they're designing their finance enterprise group, they're going to have these dimensions available to them for use. 2 of them are required. They're going to be required with absolutely every transaction that goes into the system. Those 2 are going to be the accounting entity and the account. We believe that really any accounting system used by any organization in any industry is going to require those 2 components of accounting to really be able to operate. So those are required, and you can't make them optional. Everything else is really based on your organization's needs, whether it be an industry requirement or your own management type operational requirement. For example, you'll have the ability to choose to use projects or choose to use sub-accounts. If you intend on breaking down your project costs by account, you absolutely can do that. If you want a further breakdown of your project costs, like what an account category would do, you can either use the sub-account dimension for that or any of the other dimensions that are made available to you. You can use those as a further breakdown of your project. Then you've got these 10 additional dimensions that you can use, and by no means does anyone recommend using all 10. It sounds like, great, we have 10 that we can use. I highly recommend only using the ones you absolutely need. Your services team, project team can help guide you into what really a dimension value should be, and when you should use some of the other great features like alternate structures, multiple levels, and so on. I would also like to point out that a couple of these dimensions do have embedded functionality behind them. For instance, finance dimension 2, if you do any type of project billing where you get external funding sources, external grants that you might request reimbursement for, there is embedded functionality in finance dimension 2 that allows you to do that. So keep things like that in mind. Finance dimension 1 and accounting unit, you can do zone balancing at both of those dimensions. So if there's a component of your accounting string that requires zone balancing, keep in mind that that's where you would want to put that particular component. An example that might be relevant for you guys as public sector customers is the ability to really configure the dimensions the way you need. So in this first example that I'm going to share, you would have your accounting entity be the city of, or the county of, or the state of, what have you, but at that highest level. Accounting unit may or may not be used. In this example, it's not used. You've got your object or account code project, and that's it. That's all you would want to use from that delivered standard dimensions, and then from the industry specific dimensions, you have your fund, your grant or funding source, cost category, which would be a further breakdown of your project costs, cost center, which might be your department, and then function code. So that's an example. This isn't necessarily how each of you should define your finance enterprise group, but it is an example of how I've seen some customers define theirs. This is another example, and I'd like Brenda to speak to this one. She was very familiar with this one specifically.
Sure. This is the structure we use for the city, and the accounting entity of the city. Then we use the department account and project, and then a sub account. We also had the funds and the industry specific and the funding sources and the cost categories. And what this replaced was their legacy was there was city, fund, division, department, sub-department, account, sub-account, and then their projects they had stored in specific general ledger accounts, and they had to use spreadsheets to pull those out to be able to report specifically on those projects. So we were able to pull out some of that and put it more into the structure. So we built the structure to put the division in so that the departments would roll up, and we were able, by doing that, to auto get rid of the sub-departments and again build them into the department structure. So it really streamlined that whole accounting string, and it made it a lot more simple. By doing this, we're able to get to the reports easier, and everything just sort of flows up. It rolls up into these different buckets. They can report onto the police department, or they can, the police department can roll up into a specific division, et cetera, et cetera. It just made it a lot more streamlined.
Yep, thank you, Brenda. And just to point out, within the solution, you can have as many of these summary levels as you need to for reporting purposes, and that should really be the driver of why you put those summary levels in. But as transactions occur against this posting level, the summary levels are automatically updated with the appropriate balances. So as near real time as you can imagine. Okay, moving into encumbrance accounting. So we talked a little bit about the general ledger being separate from the project ledger. Well, that functionality or that separation of the two bled into other things as well, including the budget. And so by having your general and project ledger separate, that meant that the budgets for each of those was also separate. That meant separate planning of each of those budgets, separate processing, change requests would have to be done separately, approvals for change requests, approvals for the budgets themselves, reporting. I know, those of you who know our standard reports and our inquiry screens in prior versions know that you have an inquiry screen for your GL budgets and encumbrances and commitments, and a separate one for project commitments and encumbrances. So everything was really kept separate, and you were limited to using the dimensionality at hand. So your project budget was budget based on projects and account categories. Your GL budget was for your company accounting unit account and sub-account if you were using it. So you were truly limited to those specific dimensions. In CloudSuite Financial, some of the enhancements are around how you budget in general. So you have a ton of flexibility in when you create your budget scenario, or in other words, your budget version. When you create that, you have the ability to assign specifically which dimensions you want to use. So if you've defined 8 of the 10 industry-specific dimensions, and you're using company account, accounting unit, project, sub-account, if you happen to, for whatever reason, need all of those different dimensions, you can build your budget scenarios by picking and choosing which of those dimensions make sense to be a part of your budget. Some of those things might just be for reporting purposes, some of those dimensions. Others are actually for operational and budgeting purposes, and you get to pick those. Additionally, you also get to pick whether your budget version is requires balanced changes, whether that be by amount or by unit, whether it requires balanced changes or not. So we have some, obviously our public sector customers, the change requests would need to be balanced. Some customers don't have that requirement, or even within our public sector base, there might be unit type budget lines that don't need to remain in balance. So you have that flexibility, and then you have the ability, once you've created your budget, to specify within that one single budget how you want to control spend of that budget. So your operating controls might be a little bit different than your project budget controls, and you can have as many different rules or budget templates as you need to really ensure as an organization that you are controlling the budget that you've adopted. So an example of the differences, we've got operating on the left, project budget edits on the right, and I'll point out some key things. For your operating, you might have an annual budget or a biannual budget, but you have the ability to say that your period type is by year, and you want the actual control of that budget to be done every single period. Now, we have customers who do the control by year, the control by period. You have that flexibility to choose. But in addition to that, you also have the ability to specify exactly what years should be edited against. So if this budget is for period or FY 2020 and FY 2021, you can put those years in. But if you happen to be working on your budget for 2022, maybe it's even been approved, you've adopted it, you've loaded it into the system, because your end year is 2021, nobody actually can use 2022 until you guys make it available for use. Your project budget might be completely different. Projects can span over multiple years if you need them to. And so your budget edit for your projects might be life to date instead. And when you make that selection, because of the way CloudSuite Financials works, your life to date selection takes away the start year and end year, because regardless of the year, the period that you put that budget into, the project date range really drives how you're able to spend and how the system controls that budget. Additionally, you have the flexibility to pick if the budget edit should happen at a posting level or if you're going to assign groups for the system to check. So lots of flexibility there. And it can be different. Here's the great thing. It can be different for your operating budget versus your project's budget. You don't have to do the same thing, even though they're within the same project, within the same budget. You can have different edit levels for each of them. Okay, once you've got your budget in and folks in your organization are creating transactions, they're putting in invoices, POs are coming in and being approved, you have visibility into all of that data. You have what we call, in the account analysis screen, you have a budget analysis. So in the parameters, you can put anything from your year and period that you want to analyze. You can filter on things like your expenditure accounts, or if you're doing revenue budgeting as well, your revenue accounts. You can view this analysis by entity, if you have more than one entity, by accounting unit, if that's where your departments are kept, by fund, by project, even. All of that happens in one single report rather than having to go to multiple reports to get to that information. You have visibility into it and all in one place. And in addition to that, everything you see in this bottom part of the screen that has a blue hyperlink, all of that is drillable. So now you can just click that blue hyperlink and it will take you to the details that make up, for instance, the $7,450 encumbrance. You know, what makes it up? What are the line items that came from PO? And then drill all the way back to the source document. Additionally, you have visibility into all of your commitments and encumbrances, not just by your GL string or by your project string, but by your entire finance enterprise group dimensions that you've defined to use as an organization. All of that is available to you in your commitments and encumbrances report. So you get a list of all of your commitments and encumbrances, their status, and this is a bit personalized. I've taken some of the columns away. You have the ability to personalize your reports as much or as little as you want. But you have the entire accounting string. You'll notice that you even have right on the report which vendor this encumbrance is for, what line item of the vendor or that invoice it's for. So a lot of visibility right at the surface for you to answer all those day-to-day questions that you have. Moving on to fund accounting. So this was an enhancement that is very near and dear to my heart. I've been looking for it for a while. I started out as a customer, an end user of the solution. So I do know from an end user perspective how valuable this particular enhancement is. But it's really an automated method of ensuring that transactions that occur within the subsystems are following fund accounting rules. So this was delivered back in April. We have a handful of early adopters, one of which Brenda worked very closely with and actually ran the project and ensured a successful go live. But this enhancement is delivered as disabled. So anyone who owns CloudSuite Financials today and is on a recent release of it, you have this functionality available to you, but the toggle is delivered as disabled. There are a handful of requirements, and there's a slide in here that talks about design considerations, but just briefly, we expect fund zone balancing to be enabled. So wherever you choose to put the fund, either in dimension 1 or the accounting unit, zone balancing for that dimension should be enabled. There is an action in the finance enterprise group to enable this functionality, and it asks you specifically before enabling where you've put the fund value, so the system knows what to look at when it's doing this type of enhanced fund accounting for you. So those are the two dimensions. In this example, I have fund in finance dimension 1, and org unit or department in the accounting unit dimension. What happens when you enable fund accounting is that a set of rules are delivered. Among other things, a set of rules are delivered that then tell the system, rather than accounting for things, for instance, expense accruals, payments, things like that, rather than accounting for them in the normal way that everybody else who uses the solution sees it, when fund accounting is enabled, do things a bit differently. For example, if you have an AP invoice and the expense distributions are to 5 different funds, the rules that we deliver tell the system accrue to those same 5 funds, accrue to those same 5 lines, and just change, rather than the expense account being used, change that to the accrual account that is defined on the AP code. So it's those types of rules that the system applies. But the great thing here is we understand that even within the public sector, there are unique requirements for the various customers that we have and hope to have. So we've allowed for some flexibility to override some of the rules that we've defined. So for example, in this payables fund accounting rule, you'll notice first that the type of override we're doing is for the expense accrual. We've defined a rule that really says if, for instance, an accrual happens on an invoice and there is a project number in the expense distributions, don't accrue to those same project numbers, accrue to this one other default project that we have that will take all of the accruals. In the same manner, if you have an accounting unit that should or shouldn't be accrued to, you put that in there. And finally, if you just want something to be set to blank, for instance, if I'm expensing to a few different programs, but I don't want to necessarily accrue to those, I just want to accrue to my entity and fund and an accrual account, you can set dimensions to blank as well. And you can have as many of these rules as you need. And I think the city that Brenda worked on did apply some override rules here.
That's correct. Right? So when we were setting it up, they determined that they wanted the payables to follow the fund that was on the distribution, but not the department. So we set up a rule so that it would not, it would only go to one department, but it would split it out by the different funds. And then the same thing with the cash. They wanted the cash to go to a balance sheet. It didn't want it split out by departments, but it did want it to follow the fund. And again, we used the rules to make sure that it split it out by the funds, but it didn't go down to the department level. And it worked perfectly.
Great. Yeah, that's exactly what you need to do when you want the parts of your dimension string, like the fund, to follow the distribution, the expense distribution, but other parts not to. And just so everyone knows, this isn't something that necessarily a technical person or someone behind the scenes has to do, or it has to happen in Rich Client. During your configuration, this is something that your senior resources, your project team, anyone on your project team who is doing this configuration can go in and set these rules. Just a quick example of what happens when fund accounting is enabled, and the before shot of that, what happens when it's disabled. So when it's disabled and you create a payables invoice, what happens is you expense that invoice to, in this example, a specific fund. It's Fund 204, and I know off the top of my head that happens to be my capital fund. But my AP code is defined to hit the general fund. So when I create that invoice, the system will automatically accrue to my general fund and expense to my capital fund. That means that all of a sudden I have a bunch of zone balancing entries as well to keep my two funds in balance. But what this fund accounting enhancement has done is, when the functionality is enabled, if I create an invoice that happens to be expensed to one or more funds, however many. In this example, we've got two funds, 17,200, 17,8, 11. If I expense to those funds based on the rules that were delivered and my override rules, the system will accrue to those same two funds. It'll pull the account from my AP code, which is my AP accrual account, and it'll even apply the rule to change my project number and apply the accrual to a single default project. So it does that for you in the subsystem upon journalizing. In addition to those fund accounting rules that we just talked about, we also have cash tracking by fund. That means a little bit of pooled cash, cash validations as well, but at the very basic level of this functionality, you get your cash balances by fund now right in the cash code screen. So you'll notice that there's a new tab here on the cash code that's called fund amounts, but on the main tab, or on the detail tab, I should say, you have some configuration that you can define to say, do you want to, if you don't flag either, do you want to just track cash? Do you want to restrict this cash code to certain funds? Or do you want to actually edit and validate that cash is available by fund? So all of that functionality exists now within the cash code. If you choose to edit, not only do you track everything as normal as anyone else would, but you also have the ability to track or to edit. And the great thing about this is that you don't have to edit against each individual fund if you don't want to. You can actually create groups where you can say these three funds all should really be edited together. So as long as one of those funds, or the sum of the total, has enough available cash, then we can spend out of any of those funds. So that's grouping the funds, or you can go ahead and continue to validate against each individual fund. What you'll notice also is that you have the ability to set minimum fund amounts, so you don't want the fund balance of a specific fund to go below 25,000 or 50,000. You can set those types of limits as well. Actually, sorry, going back to this real quick, I know that the city that Brenda was working with actually had some very specific requirements around sweep accounts that we were able to do. They were an early adopter, so we were able to quickly get that enhancement in and enhance the solution to automate sweep accounts.
Yeah, that's true. They do pool their cash. They have all their cash in one general fund, and every night they sweep all the other accounts, a multitude of accounts, into that one general operating fund. But then in addition to that, they divide that out to based on which fund has ownership of the cash. So the police department may have, $20 million out of a $40 million balance. And so with the fund accounting, it will keep track of all of that. The only issue that we ran into was when they were the accounts were swept. If we were going to pay out of another account, it would not recognize it as part of that group. So that the city's working really close with Lima and her team to do an enhancement request, and they've had a lot of input on how that enhancement should work. So we're expecting that out in a few months, and we're really excited to get that implemented.
We are excited to get that out to you guys. Thank you, Brenda. Okay, some design considerations to keep in mind, and this by no means is a comprehensive list of everything you should think about, but fund accounting doesn't just happen. You do have to enable it. Fund has to be an accounting unit or dimension 1. Zone balancing should be turned on. The enhancement that we did back in April and that we've continued to work on over the past few months was really applicable only to the core financials components, so AR, AP, cash, projects, grants, and so on. Zone balancing still needs to happen when there are transactions within GL or interface transactions, but don't follow the same fund accounting rules. If they cross funds, you want that zone balancing to kick in and continue to keep your funds in balance. Another design consideration, you know how the fund accounting rules are delivered. If any overrides need to happen, put those in. The cash by fund validation rules, you know, think about that. Do you want the system to validate cash availability or just track the cash for you? If you do want the validation, you have to put those rules and that setup in your design. And then there was a lot of enhancement of funds and fund ownership and fund or depreciation expense going to the fund owners. All of that is also enhanced on the asset accounting side. So think about how you want to utilize that, or if you want to utilize that functionality as well. Finally, doing a quick time check. Finally, there are some dimension features just as a wrap up to this whole discussion that I definitely want everyone to hear and to think about as they're going on this journey from prior versions to CloudSuite Financials. But there's a lot of enhancements, and I cherry picked these ones to for you guys, just so you guys can understand that even though there are a lot of differences and a lot of changes and enhancements between prior versions and this current CloudSuite Financials version, what does it really mean to you and which ones really apply to you guys? But a few of these, and I won't go into detail on all of them. Zone balancing. You used to be restricted to just that level 1 of the accounting unit structure to do zone balancing. And so your fund had, it had to be in your accounting unit level 1, or it could be at the company level, but not necessarily anywhere else in your structure or dimensionality. And you have choices now. We also have, I've talked a lot about the fund accounting piece, but we also have something called department journals. You actually have the ability to, if you have any shared costs, rather than doing an allocation, which you can still do as necessary, your project team will work with you on that. You have this ability called department journals to create sort of a journal entry charging or crediting one department and charging one or more other departments for services, whether it's a print shop or legal or what have you. You have the ability to charge that out to other departments and have each individual line go through appropriate approvals so those department heads can approve their individual charges, and then the entry is posted. You have the ability to create dimension security. So who in our organization is allowed to use these specific accounts or these projects or any of the dimensions that I've defined, but you have global ledger level security. And then structure relationships. Your dimensions that you define, you have the ability to say, this accounting entity is allowed to use these 18 accounts and nothing else, or these 12 projects and nothing else. This project is allowed to use these 5 accounts, but that definition of security and control up front ensures that you don't, you're really eliminating or reducing at least the number of errors made by end users. we've got a lot of end users working really hard with limited time, limited resources to get things in. It's inevitable that a keystroke will be made that's incorrect. The system needs to be the one working hard to ensure that that doesn't happen. Brenda, did I miss anything? Is there anything you'd like to add?
The only thing I think I would add here is that at the city, we were able to set up multiple that really helps us, because sometimes you have reporting based on the fiscal year. Other time you have reporting based on a calendar year. So that was really, really powerful. Also, the structures, we already talked about the alternate roll-up structures. Again, that helps us a lot on some of the reporting. And then we set up multiple ledgers. We set up a core ledger that's everything. We set up the audit ledger, and then the government-wide ledger that is used to do government-wide reporting, as well as the CAFR. So by setting these up all ahead of time, it makes the reporting really, really easy, and it's just a very strong feature that's really been able to help us come up with some reporting that now what used to take them weeks, months, and then sometimes it would span over multiple months, they can now do in a very short time, such as days and in some occasion, a week or 2 weeks.
That's a really good point, Brenda. To talk a little bit more about these multiple ledgers, calendars, and structures, one of the main drivers behind why we not just allow but encourage the use of these multiple ledgers and calendars is really to reduce the number of reports you have to end up building. For instance, if you have a report that you run for your using your fiscal calendar, but that same report also needs to be run using the standard calendar, you actually only need to write that report once and then just change the calendar that you're using for the output of that report. Same with the ledgers. You don't have to write multiple reports to account for the data in the multiple ledgers. If you have I'll just say a balance sheet or one of your CAFR schedules, if you have that and you want to include just your core data, anything that the 95% of transactions that go into your core general ledger, you can run that report for just that ledger. But if you want to run that same report that includes any adjustments made in your audit ledger or any adjustments made in your government-wide ledger, you can run that same report and include a different reporting basis that includes the different entities, the different ledgers, the calendars to use. All of those are put together in a reporting basis as a default, and you run that report with this other reporting basis, and all of a sudden the data is rolled up a little bit differently, and different pieces of data from these different areas are brought together, and the output is different, but it's a much more controlled environment around what data to include or exclude from reports. So thank you for pointing that out, Brenda. And I believe that's it here. I do want to just spend a couple of minutes on our Infor CSF's roadmap. I didn't want to go into the line level detail of our roadmaps. I want to talk a little bit about our initiatives and what is really important to you guys. So if you look at our 12-month view of our initiatives, we've got usability, capability, and industry. If we focus just for a second on industry, you'll notice that a lot of what we have is very specific to public sector. We've got our GovCloud initiative that actually was completed and delivered earlier, I think about a couple of months ago. But CloudSuite Financials and Supply Management is now available. It's FedRAMP authorized. It's available on the GovCloud. In addition to that, we already delivered fund accounting cash validation, but like I mentioned, it's a journey. We want to make it a well-rounded solution for our customers, but we also like I mentioned, only delivered it for the core financials components of CSF. We want to expand it into payroll. We want to expand it into supply management. So we're constantly working on those. And then financial statements. Everyone produces a CAFR, right? We want to be able to give you at least a really good start into what we deliver out of the box for your financial statements. But saying all that, what I really want to caution you against is, please don't think that just the industry-specific initiatives are what impact you or your end users. Really, everything else we have. I mean, I almost wanted to circle everything, but there are a few things that absolutely don't apply to you guys. But just in general, everything we're doing around usability, where we're really improving the end user's relationship and interaction with the solution through our 4.0 controls, that impacts everybody, including you guys, as you begin to use CloudSuite Financials. How your end users use it and embrace using the solution is really going to determine how well this implementation or upgrade goes, right? Your end users using the solution. The homepage templates, the gateway to your end users entering CSF is key, and we're putting a lot of thought into those. Dimension analysis. We have these great dimensions, and one of the main ones is fund for you guys, or maybe even function if it's not embedded within one of your other dimensions. Department, those are all dimensions that you're going to have when you use CloudSuite Financials. We want to make sure that the analysis behind it, the ability to slice and dice the data is readily available for you guys. So that I think applies to not just public sector, but all of our industries. A couple of other ones that I want to point out that aren't industry specific, but really key for you guys. The budget edit enhancements. We're doing a lot of great things. One of our enhancements was delivered, I think it was last month. It was the budget change request wizard that walks you through how to do a quick and efficient change request. So that was delivered recently, but we're doing a lot more updates in that regard. All of our InfoGo or mobility enhancements really applies to anyone using our mobile or their mobile devices to access the solution. And then Coleman, continuous accounting or just machine learning, the ability to say things like Coleman, what's still open on PO 37, and to have that information provided to you just through voice recognition is pretty powerful. Sometimes I get people who think, oh, that's too far in the future. And I used to be one of those people, but then I caught myself in the car saying, if I say it, I might get in trouble because it might actually answer. But I said, okay, Google, what's 300 minus whatever? And I had my Google in the car do that quick calculation for me. And I thought, oh, this is what Coleman would do when you don't have a freehand or when you need something quick, it gives you the answer. So all of those really apply to everyone in our customer base.